Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. This is the British Army surrendering to the Japanese. It heralded the beginning of the end for the British Empire, and it happened here. Singapore, the Garden City, known for its hotels, its food, and its shopping. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here to find a grave. Well, not a grave, but a memorial where British soldier Tom Tadman is remembered. Tom went with the Lanarkshire Yeomanry to India as a bombardier before being posted to the Malay Peninsula in 1941. And it's his footsteps that I'll be retracing to highlight the disaster of the fall of Singapore and what it meant for the soldiers sent there. So Singapore has a weird feel to it. Cars drive on the left, the road signs are all in English, but you're so far from the UK, and that's because it was a crown colony up until 1963. Apart from a few years in the 40s when it was occupied by Japan. Back then, during the Second World War, the island at the southern end of the Malay Peninsula was considered a vital part of the British Empire. It was supposedly an impregnable fortress, and Britain saw it as the Gibraltar in the Far East. It was defended by a natural barrier of jungles up in the north, and the British were confident that the Japanese would attack Singapore from the sea. It was inconceivable that an invasion would come through the jungles and swamps of the Malay Peninsula. But that's what happened. The Japanese fought through the jungles at speed, and they had orders to take no prisoners as they would slow down the advance. A pamphlet issued to all Japanese soldiers said, "When you encounter the enemy after landing, think of yourself as an avenger, coming face to face at last with his father's murderer. Here is a man whose death will lighten your heart." By December 9th, 1941, the RAF had lost nearly all its frontline aircraft after Japanese attacks on airfields in Singapore. And the Navy were also defeated after the sinking of the newly commissioned battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse off the Malay coast. Sir Winston Churchill wrote in his memoirs about the loss, "I put the telephone down. I was thankful to be alone. In all the war, I never received a more direct shock." Only the army was left to stop the Japanese advance on Singapore. It was led by Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, yeah, this guy. And despite outnumbering the Japanese with British, Indian and Australian forces, what he didn't have was tanks. At the Battle of Jitra in Malaya, Percival's men were beaten and in full retreat. The Japanese attack was based on speed, ferocity and surprise. And they had a secret weapon: the bicycle. There's hundreds of rivers on the Malay Peninsula, and to slow the Japanese, British engineers destroyed more than 250 bridges as they withdrew. But Japanese infantry could wade across the rivers carrying their bicycles on their shoulders. The British could not escape the troops on bicycles. They were overtaken, driven off the roads and into the jungle. Captured, wounded soldiers were killed where they lay, and those who were not injured but had surrendered were also murdered. By the end of January, Japanese troops had reached Singapore. The commander of the Australian forces there later said, "The whole operation seems incredible. 550 miles in 55 days, forced back by a small Japanese army of only 2 divisions, riding stolen bicycles and without artillery support." All the indications were that the Japanese would attack Singapore across the Johor Strait here. This is where Tom sent a telegram home. Allied forces withdrew across the causeway that separated Singapore from Malaya, with engineers blowing a small hole in it as the last of the British forces left. Before the final Japanese attack, Sir Winston Churchill ordered, "There must be no thought of sparing the troops or population. Commanders and senior officers should die with their troops. The honour of the British Empire and the British Army is at stake." So how, after weeks of planning, did they lose here in just 7 days? Percival spread his men across a 70-mile line, the entire coastline of the island. It was a mistake. The Japanese attacked across the Johor Strait, quickly fixing the causeway to allow tanks easy entry to the city. 23,000 Japanese soldiers attacked Singapore. At the Alexandra Military Hospital, Japanese soldiers murdered the patients they found there. And just up this hill, in a park in the centre of Singapore, is where the decision was made to surrender to the Japanese.
One would never forget that. It was 9 o'clock news on a Sunday night. And they came through and announced the fall of Singapore. There was dead silence, and suddenly a bang. My mother drops the iron on the floor. Shocked. Because we all knew then what was going to happen.
Singapore fell in just 7 days. It was the biggest ever British surrender. The Japanese took around 80,000 men prisoner in Singapore, many of whom were reinforcements and had just arrived, never having fired their weapons in anger. This is Changi Prison, the main prison in Singapore. But in the 40s, the Japanese used this area to house the thousands of Commonwealth POWs that they took after the surrender. 9,000 of these POWs died building the Burma-Thailand Railway. Others were sent to work in Taiwan or factories and mines in Japan. 6 soldiers from the Lanarkshire Yeomanry were sent from Changi to Kuching, Borneo. None of them would survive. Of the roughly 2,000 British POWs here, more than 2/3 would die. Kuching was liberated just days before orders to execute the remaining prisoners could be carried out. Tom was taken from Kuching, first being sent to Kota Kinabalu, then to Labuan, then Brunei, where his journey ended. His family would learn his full story 40 years later at a Lanarkshire Yeomanry reunion, where Len was mistaken for his brother.
He said, "Tom, you've got through." He thought I was Tom. So I quickly tapped his shoulder. No, I said, "No, I'm not Tom. I'm his younger brother." And he burst into tears and cried like a baby. They were all so glad to get home that they wanted to forget about it all. I said, "Well, that's all very well, but how about those who were left behind?"
The civilians in Singapore lived in a Japanese-occupied city until the end of the war, when the Japanese surrendered unconditionally. Many civilians in Singapore were of Chinese origin and were killed by the Japanese. After the war, Japan admitted that 5,000 had been murdered, but the Chinese population in Singapore put the figure at nearer 50,000. So this is Kranji War Cemetery, and this is where I've been told I can find Tom Tadman's name. Tom's name appears on a wall commemorating the 24,000 soldiers who died during or after the Malaya campaign and whose bodies were never found.
And you think of the horrible deaths he had. It's never left us. If you've lost anybody and they're missing and nothing can be found, they'll always be in your mind, whoever you are. You never forget them.
Intel is a new series that I've been working on. It's going to release every month. Each episode's going to be a completely different topic. But if you did like this episode, please make sure to subscribe to us. And if you want to know more about the fall of Singapore, we have an article on our website, forces.net, and the link is in the description.